everyone. Welcome to TAP Series, Talks on Architecture and Beyond. It's always a pleasure to have you joining us. And as most of you know, this year, the theme for TAP Series is about the making of architecture, where we dig for the discipline's relevance as there is a clear need to more explicitly demonstrate and discuss the architecture contribution to our environment, not only on functionality and user experience, but especially in building a more sustainable and resilient built environment. With all eyes on climate change and sustainability, there has never been a more urgent time to accelerate the discussion. And that is what Cosentino tries to achieve through organizing this TAP series. As a global leader in the manufacture and innovative and sustainable surfaces for the architecture and design industry, we want to empower the A&D community in Southeast Asia through knowledge sharing on this platform by inviting prolific practitioners to share their experience and answer to the big questions of sustainability. It is Cosentino's hope that through TAP series, we can learn from one another, provoke creativity and inspiration to find better ideas for a more environmental friendly environment in terms of form, material, composition, and production. The future starts today. At Cosentino, we are continuously creating cutting-edge surfaces that are more sustainable, more long-lasting, and recently we launched our first carbon neutral series, Sunlit Days by Charleston. In October, we are launching the serial collection with hybrid technology, including recycled materials in the composition. We are also finding new methods of production to reduce and recycle material and energy waste. But it doesn't stop there, as we are obligated to protect this planet for future generations. So let's do all our part. This is our message from Cosentino. And with no more delay, after this short introduction, I leave the floor to Jan, the curator for TAP Series second edition, to introduce our guest speakers for today's discussion. Good evening, Jan.
Good evening, Maria. Good evening, everyone. Thanks again for Cosentino to provide us with such amazing platform that we've been here every month curating, inviting amazing architects from Singapore and from the region to share their vision about architecture. This year, the theme of the TAP series number 2, it is the making of architecture, and to understand what it takes to create architecture and the time that is needed for it. COVID-19 has forced us to slow down and to reflect upon what it does to create the built environment. And so we are celebrating the making of architecture from one stage to another. And so today we wanted to invite some architects. It's a couple architect, and that I know for many years. The first encounter that I had with them was at the Venice Biennale in 2008. They didn't know me at that time. I learned from them because they were representing the new guard, the future of architecture from Singapore. And fast forward, we are here today and to listen to their talk. So Playstudio Architects became one of the key players in the built environment in Singapore, and not only in Singapore. Their architecture, their practice is fascinating, with a high level of craft, a high level of exploration in the making, by doing models, by exploring materiality. And that's what sometimes we forget in our practice. So today they will be sharing with us building economy. So just a very brief introduction on that. Building economy presents a way of liberating modal constraint in design, practice, and construction by working small and thinking big. It celebrates the notion of the non-spectacular in architecture. And that's very important, even more in Singapore, where we tend to do always spectacular elements, what actually there is a lot of architecture that is being produced here that is non-spectacular and that is celebrating the daily life of the people. So it is something that resonates strongly with their work in the Playstudio Architects. And so they will present us a small selection of their work, and to understand how they collaborate with clients and users, and ultimately for the communities. So it is for me an honor to have them with us today. I have been experiencing some of their building and with a lot of emotion. So I would like to welcome today Jacqueline and Victor, Playstudio Architects. So if we would have been physically together, I would have said, let's give a round of applause to Victor and Jacqueline. So the floor is yours, and I will come back after your talk for the Q&A session. The floor is yours, Victor and Jacqueline, for you. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for the introduction.
Jan. Thanks, Jan, for the introduction. Would like to first start to say how thankful we are to be given the opportunity to present our work on the TAP Series 2 talks. So once again, to say a very big thank you to Cosentino as well for inviting us to present our work. So if we can start sharing our screen. Right. First, a little bit of introduction about the practice. We are a design-driven architectural practice based in Singapore, and we work across all building scales within the interrelated fields of architecture, interiors, and urbanism. And it's so interesting that Jan started his introduction of us by kind of making reference to this, to the Venice Biennale in 2008, where we first met. And this slide was really a last-minute addition, as I was kind of combing through the deck of slides just 2 hours ago, trying to sort out the intro and all that. And it got us thinking. It has been 10 years since we started, and when we presented our work at Venice Biennale, it wasn't really a piece of architecture per se, but we really wanted to create or bring something to the table that talks about architecture. So what we brought forward to the table was a picnic basket. We called our installation a picnic basket. It's actually a piece of furniture that is taken from one of our interior projects from a public housing block, and it sits on a green and white checkered mat. You can't see it here, but if we can have a closer look sometime in the future, you can see that we have put in a series of residential floor plans that form the sea of the picnic mat. And in that sense, we're trying to attempt to start a conversation about architecture in locally and as well as globally. So from then on, it's been 10 years, as I mentioned just now, and this is just a quick snapshot of the works that the practice has been doing. So it's ranging from residential projects to some community institutional projects and very small projects as well. We work on some F&B projects as well as some commercial projects. And really the body of work was really underscored in the approach to design that really is informed and evolved through research, inquiry, positioning, as well as differentiation. And through these processes, we are hoping to capture the unique opportunities and constraints that are presented via a project, and through that, set up a kind of design framework that can then guide the ongoing collaboration between the architect and our clients. We have certain beliefs that architecture should be deeply rooted and fundamentally driven by an expression of form and structure that then gives a kind of synthesis when we look at various factors that will affect clients' needs, dealing with planning parameters, dealing with the physical constraints of the site, budgets, and so on and so forth. We have an interest in geometry, in organizational planning, as well as materials, and through a series of 3 projects later on, hopefully we can discuss how these snippets or these aspects of the practice really comes in to reinforce and influence the way we build. The title of today's talk that we want to share is Building Economy, and 10 years later, after 2008, in 2019, we were again invited to exhibit our work. So this time it was more on a local platform, and we were one of the 8 young and upcoming firms that were selected to showcase our work. And when we looked at the body of work that we've created, we can't help but look at it as a kind of economy, as the system of design frameworks and methods that we have constantly been trying to use and trying to work into our design process. And through the sharing of the projects later on, I would want to talk about how building economy has then become very much a project outcome that we strive to create from our work. It is really based on the idea that we should create a kind of economy in the way we design from the first point, from the onset, rather than to look at how to achieve efficacy only in the end product. So for example, if you look at a house project, you can use low-cost materials, you can construct it using simple methods, you can end up with a fairly kind of cheap and economized building. Or you can look at the design of a house through a more informed design approach that starts right from the genesis of the floor plan, to then try and create parts within the overall design that start to share the same geometrical and organizational properties, and to also have a set of scalable features that would allow us to then end up with a value-rich building. So how you design should really inform how you build, and therefore how much it costs and how it can then be valued. So building economy really for us is a kind of design economy, and that's where we would like to start today's sharing session. We will pick 3 projects from the current and past body of work. I will present two of the projects, and my partner Jacqueline will take on one of the projects and share with you the ideas. So for the first project, we would like to see it as design economy equates to a kind of structural expression. So this is a project that is in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. So for those of you that are based in Asia, you would be very familiar with the geographical position of Malaysia. It's an hour's flight from Singapore, and it's about a 3 hours drive by car. Kuala Lumpur is the capital of Malaysia, and this is a project that is situated in an area that is very, very near the KL International Airport, just 20 minutes away by car. So this is going to be the first satellite township that is slated to be built. So the project is for a sales gallery that is going to represent the new up-and-coming developments that will be coming into the township. The township is called Gamuda Cove, and the sales gallery will, in a nutshell, try to encompass and showcase a microcosm of what the township's values, ideals, and visions would be. And it is really rooted in the idea of a city in a kind of nature as a sanctuary, to of course promote livable and sustainable work, live and play environments, to also respond in some way or other to its natural surroundings, to capitalize on its location really, really close by to an international gateway, which is the KL International Airport, and to try and see if there are economies of scale to be engaged and to be reaped in experimenting and using industrialized building systems for building fabrication purposes. So a bit of understanding about our client. They are a township developer, but they really started in the infrastructure and civil engineering domain, creating and building lots of transportation viaducts and highways and so on and so forth. But in recent years, they began to look into sustainable models of development for residential and to create essentially environments that are sustainable and with lush greenery and all that. So looking at that as a kind of influence that could potentially affect how we design, we zoomed in to look at the site a little bit more. So the site is nestled right in the middle of the entire 1,500 acres site. So it's a 2.5 hectare plot of land that is situated like so. The surrounding area is the area that is called the Bukit Paya Indah Nature Reserve. So you have lots of untouched natural land, and it's really the first kind of bit of architecture that's going to come into this site. So the very first move that we thought we should be looking at doing instead of building first is to try and see if we can plant a grid of trees onto the site first as a way to also tap into our clients' expertise in creating. They have facilities to grow young trees at a certain facility and then bring them into their project sites to be transplanted on site. So we thought it would be a nice thing to showcase this capability of the client. And with that idea of a grid, then how do we bring in the grid as well as an organizational framework to start to organize the structure and the plan of our building, and then to try and see how the landscape grid and the building grid can have a part to play in influencing each other. I mentioned just now that the idea of nature and green is very much a strong component of the site. So we were also looking right at the beginning of how to bring in ideas about greenery and architecture kind of coexisting on the site, not only on a very superficial and aesthetic level, but also if there is a way to see how from a planning and organizational level, the idea of landscaping can begin to start to infiltrate and affect how we plan our buildings. Looking at the idea of the idea of green as a metaphor as well, we were looking at trying to get some kind of inspiration as well for us to try and conceive of an architectural form that could coexist with the landscape and canopy of trees that would be eventually grown on the site once the graded trees are planted in. We work a lot with models, and very quickly we were trying to articulate forms through geometry, through the idea of repetition, through the idea of prototyping, and how that generated a kind of interior space and composition of the spaces that had a kind of strong relationship when juxtaposed against the natural canopy of trees. Another view of the model. So this time, this is during a client's meeting where models were used very much to help discuss and facilitate the ideas and information exchange, looking at visualizations as well, and then more models, and then finally coming into some kind of derivation of a very symmetrical plan that is essentially anchored by 4 linear blocks that are kind of arranged in the spiraling fashion or pinwheel, if you will, and encapsulating a central courtyard which tries to showcase the idea of a sanctuary in the master plan. So you can see how the 4 building blocks, the courtyard, and the kind of linear axis for the entranceway is being positioned on site in relation to the grid of trees that was previously set up. Looking at the sectional conditions across the building, looking at the thresholds to the courtyard, and then to the building again, and then to looking at the edges to the 2 sides that are fronting the landscaping. A quick early visualization of the courtyard space, then returning back to the models to study in the greater detail how this element of the grid could be articulated as a form of structural expression as well. So from the ideas of building economy really started when we came to this juncture, when we were starting to look at how the structural grids could actually become part of the architectural expression, and how we can then derive economies of scale from looking at prefabrication, looking at rapid prototyping processes, and looking at how these elements could be fabricated off-site and then brought into site to be installed. So there were lots of discussions and detailed discussions and conversations with our structural engineer, and then to try and articulate that kind of structural system as a part of the ecosystem of building components that will form and articulate how these 4 linear blocks are going to be positioned and placed to form the general massing and the general kind of configuration of the building. That led us to devise a series of parts of components, structural components that are each slightly different because we have to, adapt them to work in different situations in the block, from the freestanding ones in the corner, in the middle, to the ones on the edges that are also propping up the facade, and to the corner elements as well. And then we have really lucky to be able to visit the prefabricating plant of our client, who has, in their portfolio already began to build using industrialized building systems. The idea of prefabricating wall panels that have services integration already within the building wall components, and to try and push that level of understanding of what they are capable of doing into the design that we have expressed through the design process. So there were factory visits to look at how the individual sloping arms of the beams could be casted, how we could introduce the cables and the cablings of services into the structural arms and the columns as well. And then looking at the full-scale mock-ups being put up in the factory, and then they were brought to site and assembled, and then looking at how the other supporting building components like the floor slabs and all the other elements and all how that all kind of feeds into the system. And then when the interior spaces began to take shape through several other site visits, how we are also looking at the interfacing of these structural columns and how they also form part of the facade expression, as I mentioned earlier on, and to begin to then see them articulated in the kind of near completion stage, where it will be, form the main kind of structural and architectural expression that anchors the main sales gallery and display space of the building. How when you then start to create the layers of experience with the structural columns, and how the facade elements come in, and then to begin to experience them against the backdrop of the gridded trees that I mentioned just now. So more views of the interior spaces, looking at the facade and some of the details from the outside, looking at how the courtyard also takes on a form of gridded 16 trees that are placed in the grid within submerged planters, and nighttime views looking at the courtyards, and also getting a glimpse of how the structural columns also can be visible from inside the building within the courtyard, which is a semi-outdoor space, and as well as from outside of the building. Looking at the kind of synergies between the design language that are used, that is offered very much by the first kind of design iteration of the structural columns, and how we have also begun to adapt that, using that as a base language to then design the facade. So all the time looking at ways to link, ways to feed into this kind of economy of design language that has already been used. Then looking at how the kind of other complementary wall elements and finishes, perhaps more warmer tone finishes, can be used to kind of create interesting juxtapositions and interesting contrasts with the kind of more stoic and more kind of rigid expression of the columns. Some more views of the courtyard, and then looking at the threshold spaces where the landscape starts to interface with the building edges. Some nighttime views, and finally, again, an external view of the project. So I'll pass it over to Jacqueline now, who will talk about the next project.
Thank you. So I continue the series of explanations of our projects with our next project. It's actually the Rainbow Center, which for people who are in Singapore, it's actually situated in the Queenstown district. To us, Rainbow Center was an exercise in design economy of modulated forms. It is actually an extension of the existing school, but Rainbow Center itself is not just a learning space, it is also a space for the community to congregate, and it's also a space that the center itself will become its headquarters. So it will be not just for learning spaces for the students, but it is also for the teachers and for the caregivers and for the different stakeholders in the, related to this project. So, so this slide basically talks a little bit about our role as the architects is not merely to also develop the brief into some form of architecture. It is also to establish a type of design framework that can actually mediate and work with the different requirements of multiple stakeholders. So often in projects, I think the architect becomes the so-called lead consultant, but they also form a way in which different parts of the team can work together, and how we can then, as the lead consultant, be able to establish a common language in a way, or common vocabulary, so that everybody can have a say on a very neutral sort of platform. So it is, again, on our role is to understand the project brief and the design for the students, the staff, the caregivers, and volunteers, and of course, how this building eventually contributes back to its local community. So we started with quite a romantic idea of perhaps aligning with Rainbow Center's ethos of to actually create a school that is beyond disabilities, because it is actually a school for children and teenagers with disabilities, but to also inspire them and to allow them to thrive in spite of these disabilities. So we actually started with an idea of modulating very, very simple forms, and to physicalize that through an aggregation process that actually starts from a very small scale, and to again maximize the potential of that by a series of a growth and a way of actually putting together small spaces to create the final built form. So the design strategy was to try and use in its smaller scale this unit of the classroom to meet with the accommodation brief. So again, coming back to what Playstudio is obsessed about is to see how we can actually use something quite small, but through a process and an organizational strategy, be able to aggregate it and to put it together such that it becomes the building that addresses all the needs of the stakeholders. So as you can see from this slide, an individual classroom is modulated and it's then put together using a collection around a central courtyard, because also it's an extension of the existing building. So the classroom itself takes on a size that then can be modified incrementally to meet with the different requirements of the brief. So on the left-hand side of the slide would be the different areas that would be required in this particular brief, and on the right-hand side is a diagram to show how the different parts are being put together, and they all circumscribe a courtyard, a central courtyard that's actually a replica of the existing Rainbow Center, which this building forms an extension to. So in terms of the plan, this is actually the existing building of Rainbow Center is on the right hand side, and the extension that we are building is on the left hand side. And we tried to use an existing typology of a courtyard, partly also because these two buildings would actually function at the same time. They would be used both as classrooms for the students, and at the present moment, the students actually start off from the new building, and they actually, as they go up through the years, they share spaces throughout both the new and the existing building. So this plan again shows similarly how spaces are linked and connected around central courtyard spaces, and this in a way also allows for a very safe experience of the school, whereby students are always encountering very similar ways in which they can navigate through the different spaces. So as we were designing the new center, it was also an opportunity for the school to start to look at a less institutionalized and a more naturalized learning model in terms of their pedagogy. And we worked a lot and quite closely with the teachers and stakeholders of the school and the caregivers of the school to see how this can actually be manifested in the architectural form. So on the top images, these are actually the existing classrooms which are flanking a very dark internalized corridor. And what we tried to do for the new school was to create a certain aggregation of classrooms around a more central internal courtyard, if you will, and that forms in its whole a sort of learning center that then does not have the experience of having to walk through very dark and probably not connected spaces. In doing the plans and in doing what we have started to do for our proposal, we have also used this design strategy to see how the classroom itself can be a tool in which we can negotiate also for funding. Because at the end of the day, this project was actually a tri-funded project that had two government agencies and also the owner, which was an NGO organization. And it actually had to be spelled out with in terms of area, how we're actually allocating the types of areas and therefore the funding that would be provided for these areas. So in a way, the architectural design was the basis for which we could actually strategize with the school on how the funding provisions have been allocated. So from the plan, we also started to look at how this can then inform the actual building of the facade and how they can be stacked up to each other. So on this slide is actually all the classrooms as it's in its individual module, but because of the additional areas that are required for some of the programs, there are these darker areas which will then be shifted incrementally throughout the floor plates. And these are also then becoming opportunities for us to introduce new sort of programs for each individual classrooms. So sometimes they are buffer areas, sometimes they are actually spaces for new activities that can be then.
But it enjoys the subtropical kind of highland climate, which is quite different from Singapore. We are much more of a tropical rainforest climate. What's interesting is that the population as well as the population density seems fairly, the population actually does not differ much, and the population density is about 4,000 people per square kilometers versus that of Singapore, which is about 7,000. What's also interesting is that Nairobi, being a city that has been gradually kind of put on this course of rapid development, has issues that most kind of quick developing countries face, which is the idea of urban congestion and traffic congestion. In a similar way, we in Singapore do have issues like that as well, and I think our fellow kind of Singaporeans will know that there are certain controls that we have put in place to regulate and to facilitate traffic flows, especially during peak hours of the day, where the government has implemented a system of paying for access into certain downtown zones. Looking at the kind of growth of the car population as well, not too different in terms of the rate of growth in both cities. But then also looking at the densification of Nairobi city and its kind of impact, the impact of the kind of rapid development on the city's infrastructure and in particular the urban public spaces as well. We will often find areas in the city that have been in a way forgotten and underdeveloped, and as a result, spaces in these urban environments become not so attractive. And that is the crux of the kind of issue and the similarities that we are drawing from Nairobi city into our site itself. The site is has a similar kind of state in terms of its general kind of disused character. It's a big site that is formerly used as a steel factory but has been abandoned, and our client is really looking at how ways in which they can develop this project site into some form of affordable housing. So looking at the site, it's quite near to the international airport. It's in a location that is called Embakasi, and around the surroundings, it houses the light industry factories such as Coca-Cola and so on and so forth. So there is a big kind of body of workers to house, as well as workers that are working in the airport and in the nearby areas. The site is about 20 minutes car ride away from Nairobi city itself. So what is interesting is that we then started to look at residential typologies, existing residential typologies that can be found in and around the area, and we quickly realized that this is something very typical in terms of how the residential estates are being planned. There is a huge a lot of land that is given to driveways and to the car, to vehicular access, and the rest of the land is then distributed to efficiently fit rows and blocks of housing blocks. We've had the opportunity to visit some of these housing estates, and very often it's the same kind of condition that we are finding. Again, this disproportionate to our eyes, this disproportionate area of land that is given to roads and to facilitate parking on the street, and whatever left is just kind of basically arranged as linear strips of greenery that is just creating some small buffers to the residential blocks. Our client is a developer in terms of providing residential housing, and they have built two housing projects prior to this project, and they are again the same genre of housing apartments, about 6 to 8 story high, very economically built. And what is interesting is that the client has invested quite a fair sum of money in the kind of construction system. So they've invested in the concreting formwork. So it's a series. They have invested in table formwork that is used to cast the concrete structures for these apartment projects. And they are actually interested to see how they can reuse the existing resources that they have, even right down to the floor plans. So putting that aside, we first responded to the issue of car parking, right? From what we have observed to be a disproportionate amount of land that has been sacrificed for roads, thereby arising in very little land in terms of greenery. We looked at what we are familiar with closer to home in Singapore, in our public housing estates, where typically we will have a multi-story car park, like a garage parking block, that is constructed specifically to take care of the car parking requirements, and we are all quite familiar with this for those of us who are from Singapore, that it actually uses a very efficient split ramp car parking system that optimizes headroom, and within a certain height allows adequate floor plates to be designed and configured to suit kind of your car parking needs. So with that in mind, we started to then look at how could we effectively plan what is essentially 45 blocks, 450 apartment dwelling units in this piece of land. So these are some of the earlier housing studies, massing studies that we did, just trying out different configurations of aggregating, of arranging the different blocks onto the site. But once we kind of solidified the idea of trying to implement or rather import the typology of the multi-story garage into this site in Nairobi, we began to see there are actually very interesting outcomes that you could have by consolidating your car parking and the area that you have allocated for driveways into a multi-story structure, thereby compacting it and then being able to free up land for more greenery, more open spaces, and perhaps greater use for the community itself. Then we come back, so we are constantly moving from one aspect of the design to another. So now we're starting to look at the constraint that we were given, which is to try and adopt the 2-bedroom existing plan of our clients' 2 previous housing developments. So how can we use that as the genesis, as the kind of starting point to develop a 3-bedroom floor plan that is very similar in nature, that could adopt the existing formwork and infrastructure that has already been catered for. So what we did was to, if you look at the diagram on the left, what we did was to liberate the plan from the central circulation core, such that they become smaller, they become more nimble and more agile, and more ready for us to see potentially through what kind of geometrical moves and organizational ideas we can begin to imbue into these plans. So what we did was to look at the kind of relationship between the facing and orientation of the units in relation to how you enter the block. So starting from the left-hand side, you have a typical mirrored plan with 2 units facing one direction, centrally accessed, and then in the middle plan, we begin to see if we can, rotate one side of it 90 degrees. So now both units begin to be able to face in different directions, giving us a bit more flexibility to respond to site conditions and site facings, that all the time keeping the point of entry the same. And then the last diagram on the extreme right hand side, what if both units are actually flipped and facing inwards instead? And there's also a kind of implication when the plan changes and how that also affects the elevational treatment of the block. Then quickly kind of using this as the base plan, so it's really just one singular floor plan, how we can look at plan aggregations, multiple iterations of one floor plan, to begin to see how a kind of smaller precinct can begin to be organized around a central courtyard space. So sometimes you will have units that are completely facing outwards, sometimes they are completely facing the internal resource of the courtyard that have been created. Sometimes they are facing in, one facing in and one facing out, to kind of deal with corner situations and adjacent situations and so on and so forth. So with that, we then put that kind of one singular precinct onto the site, and then we started to see if we can quickly mirror it in a kind of horizontally, and then you can really see where this is leading to. Then we flip it on for the other far end of the site, and then we start to look at how the central precinct can be slightly slightly different. So there's again a variant of the original aggregation of the precinct. So it also has a similar characteristic of differently faced, differently oriented units, but they are really facing a smaller courtyard and a smaller pocket of green. And then finally, how it can then be mirrored again to encapsulate a more central kind of communal area with perhaps a swimming pool and a typical clubhouse and so on and so forth. So right in midway, 2/3, 1/3 and 2/3 across this plan is where we have inserted the multi-story car parking structure to also maximize its kind of connectivity to all the different blocks, and then to try and create a circulation or a kind of road network that kind of efficiently circulates around the estate to be able to serve residents from all the different blocks. So these are just some quick visualizations of the courtyard space and its relationship being flanked by the 7 blocks around the precinct. So the courtyard space is actually slightly sunken so that you can have a safer space for children to play in, and at the same time creates a different kind of buffer in terms of levels to the units on the ground level. So looking at the central precinct and how it's kind of also, enclosing the central pool area in the top view, and on the view on the left hand side, there are these kind of long boulevards that go north-south at the 1/3 way and the 2/3 way into the plan as a kind of, again, another layer and scale and grade of green buffer. So this time around to buffer against the multi-story car park and the residential blocks. So that really sums up the kind of the last project, and in a nutshell, we do have other projects that we have completed, either completed or still on the drawing board, or have done as proposals that we are consciously trying to create like an internal ecosystem within the design process by kind of identifying the idea of efficiency, whether it's through structural expression, whether it's through the use of modulated forms, whether it's through the use of kind of multiple plan aggregations, to always try and find a way and find economy within the way we design, because we believe that from an economy in design, perhaps then we can afford to reach an economy in the final product. So I think that's all we have for this session this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you for this very inspiring talk and sharing session. So I don't know if I'm coming back on screen. Yes, I think it's, here you go. Okay. So thank you very much. And I've been listening very carefully and to look at all of the different like details and the processes that you are having. And I don't know where to start, because I took so many notes. But interestingly, there is a very recurrent element in your practice, few elements actually, and that you are manipulating, playing with at different scales. So those elements are the courtyard, the buffer, this idea of skin, the idea of like giving us a form of protection as well. So where is this coming from? Like why are you obsessed with the courtyard? Is it that you love creating those buffer? Where is it coming from?
Yeah, okay. I think that's a nice observation. We have always been interested in being occupied with building typologies. So it really all starts from the plan and the organization of spaces that begin to kind of activate the plan. And I think it's also from an Asian perspective that we are very used to the idea of courtyards being transitional spaces that maybe in a certain way create some division between spaces, but not only division, but in many cases we can see how courtyards are also instrumental in bringing people together. So I think as a kind of device in planning, it has exceptional benefits, right? So from a kind of the acoustical separation. So in the project like Rainbow Center, for example, the liberation of the classroom blocks to be able to situate them adjacent to courtyard spaces. So those spaces begin to provide relief to the learning spaces, thereby perhaps affording them a more conducive space for learning, but not only for the educational component within Rainbow Center, also for the other component, which is the office component, the workspace component, the social space component. These little courtyard spaces that are kind of staggered, as Jacqueline was trying to describe, and vertically distributed in the building. So there's two main voids where these overlapping and staggered courtyards can be found. They are really useful spaces to create, again, breakout spaces and spaces of relief for users, for people to use, right? So sometimes you just want to get out there and have a little chat with your work colleague, for example. So I think these are really interesting spaces that can be used. And to answer the question of the buffer, again, in Rainbow Center, the buffer that was created by the kind of modulation of the floor plate, starting from the classroom, the incremental shifts that we have designed into the floor plans, allow that kind of little gray zone that has been pulled away from the building grid. And that these are the spaces, because they are also changing in size, they create interesting pockets of spaces for us to articulate and to use them as environmental buffers. Coupled with the sun shading of the facade, it really helps to create a much more distilled lighting effect, which is beneficial for children and teenagers with a certain kind of disability, and also just as a kind of environmentally perhaps more friendly to the internal space as well. The courtyards, of course, feature very strongly in the affordable housing project in Nairobi, which is really kind of created out of shifting of positive blocks to create that negative space. And in the very first project that we talked about, in the sales gallery project, the courtyard was really a sanctuary, a more quiet space. So actually visitors in that space are not really allowed to enter the courtyard, because the management does not want to allow free access. But it's really a visual kind of sanctuary, as well as it just kind of creates a better amenity for the building in a way. So yeah, perhaps I don't know, maybe
I think
something just comes through in various projects that we're doing.
Yeah, the other thing you touched a little bit about when you were trying to say your observations, which I felt was very spot on, was the fact that we deal a lot with scale shifts in how we actually work on our projects. And I feel that that's something which we have always been quite conscious of as well. And in also the way that I feel we as both working in our practice as well as tutoring in the National University of Singapore, we always feel that there is something that is really fascinating about the grain of architecture, and the grain of which we design our buildings are also a little bit compilation of different scales, right, to create a certain maybe certain compositions, certain forms, certain way we should put together spaces, result in different types of grains of buildings. So I think quite interesting to us to pursue, not just in our individual building, but as a collective on an urban scale. How do we bring grain back into urbanscape? And that, I think, is quite interesting, especially in Southeast Asia, where you have Singapore, which is a very, very controlled planning. There's very, very controlled planning parameters, but there's also other parts of Southeast Asia which has a more ad hoc sort of a grain in their urban fabric, right? And I think that that's always been quite interesting for us in Singapore, especially because within that very controlled environment, how do we then allow for slippages to happen within the building itself that then questions and gives rise to things that can happen perhaps in less regimented sort of like urban fabrics?
Yeah, and thanks for this answer, because actually you've been addressing quite a fair bit of my questions. But there is something that I find fascinating, because you share with us your recipe, this idea of the space in between, the idea of the courtyard. That is definitely, it's an added value. It's an added value, especially when we see on the pictures how the end users are utilizing the spaces. You can really feel this idea of between inside and outside, to have the freedom of being outside, but at the same time to be protected, especially for the Rainbow School. But there is something that you did not really touch upon, which is your design aesthetic. And if I may comment on that design aesthetic, is that this idea of the skeleton, the structure that is very simple, on which you add a skin. All of that seems very effortless, and there is a certain beauty in it. And the same way that this skin has been placed onto that sales gallery, when we look at the skin on the Rainbow School, it is like, it's pretty much solid, that skin, but it looks so natural, so light. So how do you work on that? Are you exploring constantly how to make things as if it is no effort, so simple, it is there? How do you do your magic, basically?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I mean, we hope that it is it appears so to people, but I think to us, really, communications, especially because we are also a very small firm, and as the projects that we share are sometimes not even in where we are. They are in Malaysia, they are sometimes in other parts of Southeast Asia, and the furthest we have gone to is to Africa, right? So how do we communicate to the builders, to the fabricators, to the people that are actually going to be building this building? What is it that we want to communicate with them? And actually, from the very start of our career and our practice, we have always been quite concerned as well as to what we use to build our buildings with, because every time we embark on a project, it's like finding out again contextually what is the most available resource in that particular region, for example. So if you look at our projects that we have on our website, we have projects that actually deal with sustainability, not through a lot of the kind of sustainable buzzwords, but also in terms of how we actually resource for the project in the materiality, and in how we economize through finding out what is a very readily available resource, not just in the actual product, but also in the knowledge behind that product. So in Nairobi, for example, we had to go with that very simple plan, not just because of a certain obsessive nature that we also bring to our projects, but because the resource is that it is that very simple table formwork that has already been invested in by our client, and with that constraint, the architecture starts to happen. So I think we have been always quite conscious about how we tap into the knowledge base that has already been around before us, and also in the expertise of our partners, in our construction partners, and in the partners, consultant team partners as well. So I think that's also quite key to being a communicative practice. I think I hope we have been that. So
I think so. And in this, because I can see some of the comments of the audience. So am I still? I'm still here. So I see the comments of the audience that are really appreciating the human scale that you are creating, and in this we can really see here the architect as a builder, as a master builder. Most of the time, architects are not necessarily understood by the people. What are architects doing? What is the daily life of an architect? And here you are demonstrating through your processes, model making, highly exploratory prototyping, and all of these like handmade elements. It is something that is carried all the way to the end product. And as you mentioned, this learning from the expertise of the others, the knowledge behind the product, it is something that you are totally absorbing, and then that you are giving back into the architecture. So is it something that you hope in doing in your project to give back this human scale, human touch, almost as if, although you might not be on site because you are not locally in the same environment, but as if you are there with the team, fabricating, constructing, contributing to that physical outcome?
Yeah, I would say so. Definitely, the idea of the human scale is something that we perhaps endeavor to plan into the design. Of course, we have to be quite sensitive in terms of the proportion of things that we are doing, the sizes of spaces that we are trying to create. So on the kind of larger intellectual level, definitely that is almost a default kind of mode of thinking that we should go on. When it comes to the other level of the human scale, which is when things get built or things are in the process of being built, we really work with the materiality as well, where sometimes it could be very much economically driven by cost as well. Just to limit the size of things will ultimately mean that you can kind of bring it in at a cheaper rate. But also, I think it has tremendous spin-off effects, tremendous benefits, because you get to satisfy that issue, the aspect of grain that Jacqueline was talking about, the idea of the grain leading into the kind of eventual tectonics of the architecture. So that's definitely something good. And also the kind of size of things, of elements begin to be more human scale in a way that the people that are building it can work on the elements, the building elements effectively, right? And to be able to communicate to them on that level definitely was one of the most enriching experiences that we have when we did a project in Batam. We were pretty much not hands-on, as in we of course we didn't build, but we witnessed a lot in the making of some of the prefabricated concrete corrugated panels for the facade as well. So again, the idea of trying to work with what is already there, perhaps, and also to think bigger about how you want to design with the scale in mind, and do not kind of see the idea of smaller size elements as a limitation, but to try and exploit and go beyond that limitation. Maybe somehow it has come together in strange ways to create the building outcomes that we all see.
Mm.
And in this, in all of your development and of what you have been describing, you mentioned briefly just now that you are both teachers at the National University of Singapore. So how do you juggle between basically your practice as an architect with all of the different exploration that you can do, and at the same time teaching in a university with a fair bit of student as well? So how do you have this back and forth, this dialogue between practice and theory? Do you learn yourself things at school that you are utilizing in your project and vice versa? So how do you negotiate between those moments of practicing and those moments of theory?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's a question that we always ask ourselves, and it's really the question that inspired us to teach, inspired us to be a part of academia, inspired us to see if there are opportunities for practice and education to kind of speak to each other in a dialogue. I think the right word is a dialogue. So far, I think that that's the overall aim. But sometimes I personally feel that it's a conscious effort to try and bridge them together. Because if you teach like how you practice, and if you practice like how you teach, I think you won't be able to close the gap. So when I teach as coming from where I practice and how I practice, of course it will influence the way I teach, but I won't teach what I practice. I hope I'm not being too vague or abstract here, but I won't teach exactly the things that I have shared just now, because those are more practice-driven kind of constraints, more practice-driven kind of ideals, more practice-driven kind of parameters. But I would take the same sensibility that I have in practice to develop a kind of related syllabus for teaching.
And I think something that we do try to bring through from practice to teaching is this idea of constraints, which I think features quite strongly in the work that we do in practice, because we tend to want to not be free in terms of not in terms of the inspirations and the products that come out, but actually in the type of thinking that we do, we try to be a little bit more streamlined into trying to develop it in a certain way, and to try and bring that way of thinking throughout the lifespan of the project, and not to be so-called open to many different avenues in which you deal with space, deal with development of space and development of architectural form, for example. So as you see through our projects, perhaps quite boringly, we tend to stick with a certain way of thinking for each of the projects, and we try to carry that mode of thought through from different scales, from different way we envisaged interior spaces, all the way to external spaces, to the way we look at how we can even talk to our consultants and make them also think the same way that we think sometimes. And in that way of thinking, we try to influence our students by constraining them to think quite deeply from one thread or one way in which they can conceive their projects. Because I think at the end of the day, especially in today's world, there's so many choices that are available, and actually deciding and choosing the correct choice seems to be more difficult than the actual work that they have to take place.
Thank you very much for all of that. I think we have reached the end, because I can go on and on and on, but we have limited time, and so just for the last word of the conclusion. So it was a true pleasure to have you today. And what amazes me and what is fascinating to me is the consistency in your practice, in your exploration, like constantly researching for a form of well-being for the occupant. And that we can feel it in your practice. We can feel it in the way that you are also teaching to the student. Architect, practitioner, teachers, husband and wife, parents of 2 kids. Also, Jacqueline, I know that you are doing pottery as well. So I don't know how many qualities that you have in your bags. So I hope that today our audience has been inspired by your practice. It was an honor to have you today. So thanks again, Jacqueline and Victor. True pleasure. And so I will leave it to Maria for the last word to close the session of today. Thanks again. Maria, over to you for the closing address.
Okay. Hello again, Jacqueline, Victor. Thank you so much for your detailed and enlightening presentation. I'm sure that you have awake someone's creative ideas after showcasing these 3 projects. So for Cosentino family, we really appreciate you to be part of the TAP series 2nd edition. And to our audience, thank you very much for supporting us every month. We see you next month in Thailand, right, Jan?
Yes, well, physically here, but connected to Thailand. So stay tuned for our next guest from Thailand. Really happy to have them coming to talk to everyone. So stay tuned for the next month with Thailand.
Yes, correct. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jan, again.
Yes.
Bye, Jacqueline, Victor.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.